My name is Andrew Eriks. Once I lived in a city called New York. My mother's name is Terry Eriks, and you can find her in the phone book. If you happen to be in the city, please help me find a way to contact her. I miss her dearly, and I want to go back home. It all started when I turned 25 and decided that it was time for me to stop taking my backpack to work. I wanted to look more professional and mature. However, this meant that I had to give up reading on the subway since my paperbacks wouldn't fit in my pocket. Using a briefcase wasn't practical since I worked in a factory and messenger bags didn't appeal to me. To pass the time during my half-hour subway commute, I used to listen to music on my MP3 player. However, it would shut down after every song if I didn't skip to the next manually, so I stopped using it too. As a result, I spent my mornings and afternoons observing my fellow passengers. Being a bit shy, I didn't want to get caught staring, so I learned to watch them discreetly. Interestingly, I discovered that many people were uncomfortable in public, but they covered it up in different ways. Some fidgeted constantly, shifting their weight or moving their legs closer to the bench. I started categorizing them in my head. They were the most noticeably nervous types. After them were the fake sleepers, who would take their seat and practically close their eyes in the same second. Most of them weren't really sleeping, though. The real sleepers shifted more and came awake suddenly at stops or after loud noises. The fakes just zoned out from the moment they sat until the train pulled into their stop. Then there were the MP3 player addicts, the occasional laptop users, the people who traveled in groups and talked too loudly, and the cell phone junkies who were either very popular or just completely unable to shut up for more than 2 minutes at a time. Just as people watching was starting to get unbearably boring, I noticed my first incongruity. It was a middle-aged man with brown hair, average size and weight, and casual dress. Oddly enough, he seemed almost too normal, with no remarkable features or mannerisms that would make him stand out from the crowd. It was that which led me to notice him. I was intentionally trying to observe how people behaved on the subway, and he didn't seem to behave at all. He didn't even react. It was like watching someone sitting in front of a television, watching a documentary about fish. They aren't excited, aren't engaged, but they aren't looking away either. They're present, but not accounted for. He would be on the subway in the afternoons. It was more than a month into my people-watching experiment before he caught my eye. I didn't take the same subway every day, nor did I consciously sit in the same car when I did. I first saw him on a Monday, I believe, and then again on Thursday of the same week. He obviously caught the same train and sat in the same car, even in the same seat. OCD much? I thought at the time. Since he had caught my attention the first time, I watched him more closely the next. He was downright unsettling. He didn't do anything at all. He sat there expressionless, head straight, no matter what happened. Even when a woman with a wailing child entered the car and sat right behind him, he didn't so much as turn his head or frown in annoyance. That kid was loud, too. By the time the subway reached my stop, I found myself queasy, and when I exited the car, my hands were shaking like I was having a nicotine fit. There was something about that man that was just wrong. He was, I thought, some kind of freak. A sociopath, maybe. One of those quiet guys who, it turns out, has a dozen women's heads in his freezer, the first victim being his mother. I found myself intentionally dawdling after work in the afternoons, stopping to browse in kiosks in the mall near the subway, even when I didn't intend on buying anything. For a couple of weeks, I avoided taking that particular subway. And when I found myself at the stop and saw that train pulling in, I made sure to choose a train car as far away from the one I had seen him in as possible. Then one morning, I saw another person who set off the same warning bells in my head. It was a woman, just as plain-looking and out of place in the hustle and commotion around her. I realized later that the moment I recognized her was when my obsession began. My people-watching, which had started as a hobby to stave off boredom, became a religion to me. I couldn't enter a subway or ride a bus without finding myself examining everyone, mentally checking off a list in my head. Plain clothes of solid colors with no branding? Check. No expressions or casual glances towards other passengers or out the windows? Check. No bags, purses, or accessories? Check. Check, check, check. We've got another one. I started calling them the strangers. I didn't see them every day, even after I started taking the metro more than I needed to. Even when I found myself riding buses out of my way in the evenings, they weren't always there. But they appeared often enough to set my teeth on edge, make my palms sweaty, and my throat feel dry. If you've ever given a speech, you might recognize the feeling. Even though they didn't pay me the slightest bit of attention, I felt like I was on display for them. I could see them plain as day. How could they miss me? They didn't, though. Not in any way that I could tell. And eventually, my curiosity overpowered my fear, and I decided to follow one. I chose the man from the afternoon subway who always sat in the same seat. I got on the train and took a seat behind him. We rode to the end of the line, and he got off before I did. Keeping my distance, I tailed him, but he didn't go far. He sat on a nearby bench, as expressionless as always, and I turned a corner and waited, trying to look nonchalant. After a few minutes, the next train arrived, and I watched him board it and take the same seat. I couldn't find the nerve to follow him again. He hadn't gone anywhere. He just rode the subway to the end of the line. And then what? Did he ride it back? What possible reason would he or anyone have for that? It nagged at me long after I rode a later train back home and tried to get some rest. I couldn't leave it alone, not until I could make some sense of it. I found myself more than confused. I was downright angry now. Why was this uncanny bastard, this almost inhuman person, riding subway trains back and forth, going nowhere? The mind, I once read, recoils from certain things because the very sight of them is an affront. Spiders set it off in a lot of people, particularly great big ones. They just look wrong to us, alien. That was the effect the strangers were beginning to have on me. They offended my senses. I followed him again the next day, and the day after that. Every day for at least a week, we made our silent trips together, though only I knew it. By the end of the week, I was following him for hours, until the last train that stopped near my apartment block that night. I wasn't people watching any longer. I was person watching, stranger watching. I didn't have eyes for anyone else, though I noticed more than a few confused glances sent my way peripherally. Other than that, we two might have been the only two people on the planet, for all I cared. The next week, I lost my job. My manager was kind but firm. I wasn't concentrating, had no focus, and wasn't being productive. It was actually quite a speech, I think, but I could barely hear it. All I could think about was my new work, my vigil. What would that man, no, that thing on the subway, get up to when I wasn't there to keep an eye on him? I left work for the last time at noon that day. Normally, I'd have started tailing my subject at 5:30, but I was sure that he'd be waiting for me. I wish now that I'd paid more attention to that day. Was it sunny? It was summer, after all. I could have walked around downtown, maybe checked out a few pretty girls. I could have had an iced cappuccino and a smoke at an outdoor cafe and then gone home, put my growing obsession out of my head, found a new job and taken to reading on trains and buses again. Instead, I waited. More than one train goes up and down the lines, so I sat in the station for at least an hour until I saw him through a window. I walked into the subway car and noticed that for the first time, my skin wasn't clammy, my hands weren't shaking, and my heart wasn't pounding hard. I sat for the first time, right across from him, directly in his line of sight, watching for a change in his face. Would he recognize me? If he did, I saw no sign of it, and I was looking hard. We must have made quite a pair, sitting across from one another that afternoon, staring at and into one another. It was hard not to let the building rage in me contort my face, but with effort, I was able to keep as still and expressionless as him. Inside, I practically screamed at him. "React to me, you fucking asshole. See me, damn it. I know you for what you are." I didn't get a response, not the first trip around, or the second, or the third or 10th. We rode far into the night together, and at each terminus, we got out together and waited. I sat right beside him on the bench, watching him from the corner of my eye, and still got nothing from him. But two could play that game as well as one. Finally, we made our last trip together. I had him, and I knew it. It was the last trip of the night before the train stopped running. I'd always let him get away from me at that point, because the end of the line was a long way from my home, and the buses stopped running at the same time as the subways. But this time, I'd follow him, finally see what he was when the train stopped running. I'd get some answers, maybe. The subway rolled on, and anticipation grew in me. The car emptied out around us slowly, until it was just the two of us silent watchers below the city. I fought to keep a manic grin at bay, and the subway train slowed to a crawl, then stopped. It was the end of the line. The stranger remained motionless, giving no reaction as the car doors stood open. Faint sounds of stragglers leaving the station echoed in the silence as the speaker system announced the train's arrival at the terminus. Still, the stranger remained unresponsive. Finally, the sound of footsteps approached, belonging to a conductor or someone similar checking each car for any remaining passengers. Despite this interruption, I kept my gaze fixed on the stranger. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the conductor enter our car, his eyes scanning over us with a puzzled expression before he moved on. The train's forward car was also checked before it started up again, continuing on its route through more tunnels. As the train rode on, it eventually looped around and came to a stop at another station. Trains on either side of us and beyond were visible through the windows. Then, for the first time, the stranger smiled at me, a slight curl of the lip that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been scrutinizing his face for hours. "So," he spoke in a rough baritone, "here we are." I tried to respond, but my throat had clenched with fear. It was as if the underground cavern had collapsed on me, leaving me coughing and stammering. Finally, with a raspy voice, I managed to ask the question that had driven me halfway to madness. "What are you?" Ignoring me, the stranger stood up as the train doors opened. Shockingly, he turned back to me. "Coming?" he asked, not waiting for my answer before walking out onto the platform. I hurried to follow, shouting after him, "Talk to me! Who are you? Why do you ride the metro all day?" He continued walking without looking back or slowing down, and I couldn't see any reaction on his face. I trailed after him, shouting for a while before eventually giving up. It seemed like 5 words were all he was willing to give me. We walked along the platform until we reached a junction and turned, now walking perpendicular to the trains around us. The path ahead was lit from above, but I couldn't tell where it led. I noticed there were an overwhelming number of trains, more than necessary for one city, but it didn't occur to me to question it at the time. I lost track of time as we walked, my watch broken and cell phone without service. The stranger stopped occasionally to examine a subway car before moving on, and it took me a while to notice the subtle differences between them. Some were slightly larger or smaller, and the front part where the conductor sat varied in appearance. I wasn't sure what he was searching for, but eventually he must have found it. We turned again, and the subway doors opened when he came to a stop in front of them. We boarded and took our seats. "Are you finally going to talk to me?" I asked him, but received no response. Frustration mounting, I contemplated punching him in the face when suddenly, the lights in the car came on, and the engine started. "What the fuck?" The stranger gave me a sorrowful look. "You won't be able to go back," he warned. "Go back where?" I demanded, but he remained silent. The train jolted into motion, heading in a direction opposite to the one we had come from, I think. The sheer number of trains had disoriented me. We traveled for a few minutes before slowing down as we approached a stop. The stranger's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, I sensed him looking directly at me. "Be still. Be silent. Don't attract their attention." As the train stopped and the doors opened, a horde of creatures began to board. Their bizarre clothing, impossibly long arms with hands almost touching the floor, jet black eyes, angular faces, and blue-gray skin left me in shock. It took a moment for my brain to process what I was seeing, and I barely managed to suppress a scream. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst. I was like a taut guitar string, every fiber of my being trembling. My vision swam, and I vomited, clenching my jaw shut to prevent a sound. The stranger's words echoed in my mind. "Be still. Be silent. Don't attract their attention." The day was a blur. We rode the subway car up and down the line, the stranger remaining expressionless for hours, maybe even days. It felt like an eternity compared to the line I knew, the one I had followed him along. The monstrous beings surrounding us paid us little attention, despite our obvious differences. I was so paralyzed by fear that when we finally returned to the endless expanse of trains and were alone, I broke down in tears. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably while the stranger watched impassively. When I regained control of myself, I looked at him imploringly. "Take me home," I croaked out. "Please." "I can't," he told me. "I don't know which one of these will lead you back, if any of them will." He stood and walked out onto the platform, and I rose wearily and followed him. He spun around sharply. "I think you followed me enough." The rage I'd felt for him before, that the panic had temporarily buried, rose up in me. "What?" I screamed, rushing forward. I grabbed him by the shoulders and with a burst of insane strength I didn't even know was in me, slammed him up against the side of a metro car. "You fucking son of a bitch, what the fuck did you do to me?" I slammed him again and again. "Take me back!" He bore it all passively, and soon the flare of anger in me guttered out, leaving me hollow. "Please," I begged, "please take me home." "That's not how it works," he said. "If we stay together, it's more likely that we'll be noticed. Go your own way. Be still and subtle, and they'll think that you're one of them." "How could you do this to me? Why?" He gave me another almost sad look. "I had to. You will too. You get stuck sometimes." He brushed my hands off his shoulders and turned to walk away. I fell to my knees, suddenly out of strength, and watched him leave. At the junction, he turned back to face me. "I'm sorry." And then he was gone. I stayed there, on the cold tiles, for a very long time. I curled up into a ball and wept for a while. After there weren't any tears left in me, I managed to get some sleep. When I awoke, the subway train I'd come on was gone, off carrying more blue-gray abominations to wherever blue-gray abominations go. I couldn't handle going back there anyway. I tried to find my way back to where I had started, to find a subway that I recognized, but I wasn't even sure which direction I should have been going in anymore. I walked for an hour, then another. Finally, I found one that might have looked familiar. Or maybe I was desperate enough to imagine that it did. When I stepped up to the door, it opened for me, and I took a seat. It started up, and despite being a lifelong agnostic, I prayed my heart out. The train slowed to a stop, the doors opened, and for a second, I thought I was saved. People. Human beings. I'd be the most devout man in the world. Then I noticed the eyes. Specifically, the third large eye in the center of their foreheads. Well, fuck you then, God, I thought. They were easier to take than the last bunch, though, and I was thankful for that. The third eye blinked independently of the other two, though, and that was nauseating. And when one of them smiled, laughed, or spoke with another, I couldn't help but notice that their teeth were sharp, misshapen, and yellow-green with filth. But if I was careful and selectively blind, I could pretend for a while that I was home. Until one of them entered with a sandwich in hand, and I realized with a start that I was starving and hadn't eaten or drunk anything in what must have been days. At the next terminus I came to, I decided to try and find something to eat or drink. I don't know why I waited, but it seemed important to ride to the end of the line. I got there and could barely bring myself to leave. I'd never seen the stranger leave the underground, and I'd never seen him eat or drink either. My stomach would not take no for an answer, though. I steeled myself, tried to keep my face carefully neutral, and made my way out into the station proper. And then I got confused. I was looking for escalators, stairs, or something like that, but all I saw were holes in the ground, walls, and ceiling. Gaping, irregularly sized holes, like I was in the middle of a beehive. What was I supposed to do? Leap into one? It didn't make any sense to me, not until someone came through one. He floated up through the floor, and then floated by me. He frowned for a second, or at least I think it was probably a frown, but apparently whatever kept them from recognizing me as an alien in the subway extended at least this far. It did not, unfortunately, allow me to levitate, which seemed to be the only way out of the subway station beehive thing. Swearing, I made my way back down to the tunnel. I was angry, lost, starving, and I'd been abandoned to a fate that, if it wasn't worse than hell, was at least twice as stupid and 3 times as nonsensical. I was not in the best frame of mind, which I feel excuses the mistake. Normally I take corners with a wide berth because everyone knows that if you just dart around a corner sharply in a public place, chances are decent that you're going to walk right into someone, as I did. I slammed into someone, a woman, and fell to the ground. Without thinking, I reacted like any New Yorker would. Badly. "Jesus fuck, you stupid bitch, watch where you're going!" I realized my mistake even before she did. Her eyes grew quizzical and confused, and when she really noticed me, they bulged with horror. She leapt, floated quickly, back from me and let out something scream-like. A little more yowly than I was used to, but I got the point. Further down the tunnel, I saw alien 3-eyed heads turning towards us. I thought suddenly about all those sharp, filthy teeth, and just like that, I was running. The subway train wasn't there, but there was a walkway along the tunnel. For the repairman, I assume. That's who'd use it where I'm from anyway. I took it at full speed and just kept running until each breath felt like getting stabbed. I stopped, panting, and looked back. The tunnel had curved, so I couldn't see the light anymore, but nobody appeared to be following me. Going back, though, was not an option. I continued forward in the dark for a long time. Eventually, I came to a small opening in the wall and stopped there for a rest. Hunger, despair, and a full-speed terrified run had left me absolutely drained. I probably would have wept again, which seemed to be all I was capable of lately, but it just seemed like too much work. I sat against the wall, legs splayed out, and imagined beating that bastard stranger to death with a hammer. It was a relieving image. A rat was shuffling around nearby in the dark. Every so often I would kick out a foot to scare it away, but after a while, I didn't even bother with that. Rabies or any other disease it might be carrying would be a blessing compared to endless traveling through the subways of strange worlds, lost, destitute, and alone. When it crept near me again, I didn't shoo it off. Even when it reached and pressed against my leg, I couldn't bring myself to care. Not until a train passed by, and the lights of its cars lit up the culvert I was in, and I saw the thing that I had thought was a rat. It was rat-like, yes, but not as much as it was spider-like. If someone had bred the two of them together, the resulting abomination might have been almost as horrible as the thing nuzzling my leg. I shrieked, flung myself up from the floor, and kicked it like a soccer player, right into the opposite wall. Its back made a sickening crunch, and I watched it twitch out its last before the final car passed and the darkness returned. And in the darkness, a terrible thought came to me. I wondered if it was edible. I didn't want to, and I gagged just imagining it, but I was hungry, and there was no guarantee that I'd be able to find food in this place, or ever again. Rat spider was my only option. I held off as long as I could, but in the end, survival trumped squeamishness. I had my lighter, but nothing to light on fire. I picked meat off its carcass and cooked it a little by holding it over the flame, but it didn't help much. Nothing could have. Its meat was foul. More foul than anything you can imagine. I've been that desperate for food since, and eaten many other questionable things, but nothing has ever been as bad as the rat spider was. In retrospect, that is when I became a stranger. Before, I'd struggled to reach that expressionless state the other had maintained. What I'd taken for calm was numbness. A sharp rock thrown in a river will, over time, have its edges rounded off by the water beating over it, and what I'd gone through had done the same. Tearing up and eating a monster in the dark, below an alien world, the last of my edges smoothed. By the time I left the darkness and came back into the tunnel, I was as expressionless and empty as the one who'd led me here had ever been. That was not the worst of it, though. The worst came later, the first time I got stuck. The stranger had mentioned it, but in the state I'd been in, I had hardly noticed. One night, at the end of the line, I was asked to leave the train. The world was one of the closer to normal ones. The people were almost human, as I recognized it. They were orange, sure, and hunchbacked, but other than that, they were practically normal. After the last world, where the people had been hideously overweight, six-breasted hermaphrodites with no noses, the orange guys were pretty much beautiful to me. I thought at first that the conductor was talking to someone else, but I was the only one in the car. And moreover, I understood him. The oranges certainly hadn't been speaking English all day, but nonetheless, I could understand what he was saying. When I stood, I began to realize why. I couldn't stand up straight. I was hunchbacked, and as I saw in my reflection against the window as I exited, orange. I pieced together the rest from there. Stuck meant that I was trapped in this world for some reason, and stuck looking like them as well. It would be handy if I wanted to take the opportunity to leave the subway station, which is possible most times, but requires a lot of care, and is quite overwhelming. Alien worlds can be quite disconcerting, I've found. You try to compare them to your own, but the differences are so vast that they can be overwhelming. I left that subway anyway, because it was clear I wasn't returning to the central hub, what I'd taken to calling the infinite line of subway trains, that night. Or any other night, I soon discovered. Whatever had allowed me to go unnoticed wasn't working any longer. I considered, briefly, staying, But this place wasn't home, and could never be. Even if they looked like me, their culture was bound to be different. That was a lesson I'd learned before. Even worlds where the people are absolutely indistinguishable from me are fraught with danger. I was once on a world where the people looked just like me. Well, actually they looked Brazilian, but that was more than close enough. And learned the hard way that the gesture which meant hello to me signified something gravely insulting. Insulting enough that I'd been beaten half to death while a crowd looked on with approval. Besides, even if that place had a culture I could imitate, I didn't want to stay. I wanted one of two things: to find my way home, or to find the stranger who'd set me on this path and beat the shit out of him. Nothing else would suffice. So, I wanted to move on. I wasn't sure, though, if I could do to some poor sucker what had been done to me. Could I really force someone else to wander the eternal underground like me? It turned out, I didn't have to. After a few months, one of them did notice me, yes, and began to follow me for weeks. I very carefully made it seem like I hadn't seen him, just like the stranger had. But I was torn between the desire to warn him away and the desire to bring him to the end of the line so I could leave his dismal world already. The last night, he followed me to the end of the line, just as I had once done. He hadn't managed to work up the nerve to sit right across from me, though, and as soon as the train stopped at the terminus, he rushed off. I waited, hoping the conductor wouldn't see me and I could continue on, but to no avail. I left the car, and the metro rushed off without me, and I cursed inwardly. As I walked around the corner towards the ticket booths, the young man who'd been following me attacked. He had a wicked curved knife and should have caught me by surprise, but I'd been traveling through hostile alien worlds for several years. My reflexes were sharp. We struggled viciously before I managed to wrestle the knife from him. I don't know how it got in his neck. I don't think I wanted to kill him. I hadn't even been that angry, remembering my own building rage from so long before. Afterward, as he lay there, bled out, I got angry. I kicked him repeatedly, shouting, "You idiot! You were supposed! Kick, kick, to follow me! Kick!" I fled the scene of the crime, but not for long. I was there bright and early the next day, to catch the first subway of the morning. And that night, when I rode it to the end of the line, I was invisible to the conductor again. I guess you can either kill them, or bring them with you if you want to return to the central hub. I was invisible again, but I was also orange and hunchbacked still. I stayed that way until the next time I became stuck. The next time I killed. That one went much faster. I didn't wait for her to follow me. Once I was recognized as a stranger, I recognized her as the next one, and I made my choice. I won't bring anyone else into this. It makes me wonder, though, about the stranger who inducted me. I wonder what he originally looked like, and whether he knew he could have killed me. I wonder, too, about the others I saw back home, and the rare few I've come across since I left. Do they kill them or take them? And whichever one they choose, do they consider it a mercy? I can't bring myself to talk to them, to ask. We're damned either way, and the damned should suffer in solitude. I've killed 15 of them now, and I've become very skilled at it. But I've made a decision. I'm done killing innocents, at least. Before I returned to the central hub, I filled a backpack with as much paper as I could cram into it, and I wrote this story. Over and over again, to be left in as many subway trains as I can. A couple of thousand messages in bottles, cast into a sea of steel rails. This is a request, and a warning. My request above was that you find my mother and tell her a lie. It's a white lie, don't worry. Tell my mother that I love her, and that I am trying to come home. It may give her some hope or a small measure of peace. I wish it were true, too. But here's the thing. I've been thinking of myself as like Odysseus, lost and adrift, looking to return to familiar shores. But I am not lost at sea. I am lost in endless tunnels, the labyrinth. The difference is important because labyrinths are designed, built. Somebody or something made this impossible place, and they must be held accountable for what they've done to me. They cast me as Theseus, not Odysseus, but I won't play that part any longer either. The strange rules of this place have turned me from the human I began as into something else, then something else again. They have made me a monster, and so I will be the minotaur of this labyrinth. And if I can, I will tear it down around me and destroy those that built it. My warning is that you should be very wary, in public places, of silent, expressionless men and women. Keep your distance. They may kill you, or they may do worse. If you see them, run far and fast. And even more importantly, I warn you, I beg you, don't ride the train to the end of the line.